Good morning, all. Great pleasure to have you. My name is Bert Hofman. I'm the chair of the Department of Epidemiology of the Harvard Chan School, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to the next great frontier, a conversation about COVID vaccine development. You will hear four of our colleagues speaking about COVID and vaccine development, and they are really major players in the research and development and in the epidemiology and other aspects, scientific aspects of the pandemic that we live in. Their work, of course, is timely and timeless, as we hope our scientific contribution is, and it is that I was invited to introduce them because I'm the chair of a new initiative, the Human Immunomics Initiative, that we have started at the Harvard Chan School in collaboration with the Human Vaccine Initiative. And the idea is to try to understand and modeling the immune system, to see how an immune response, what the determinants of an immune response are, and to relate that to existing disease threats. And with a particular emphasis there will be on aging diseases. And as we can see, and we'll hear later on, COVID-19 is one of those diseases. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Sri Sastry. You will hear him in a minute. He is a 1990 graduate of the Harvard Chan School, very appropriate in this alumni week. He's an ophthalmologist in private clinical practice in Bethesda, Maryland, but he has a special interest in global health and prevention of blindness, and he really has many projects in which he advises hospitals and industry and startup companies to develop new technologies. It's a great pleasure, Sri, to have you here. Thank you very much for your generosity of time and all your efforts for Harvard Chan. Dr. Sri Sastry.
Thank you, Bert, and greetings, fellow alumni. As a graduate of Harvard Chan, I've always felt a great pride in our school and our alumni, but never more so than in this crisis that we're having right now. Each day, the words of our faculty and our staff spread across the world through journalism, social media, newspapers, and their conviction and courage in their words is precisely what we need right now. Their truths are both evidence-based and practical in application. And each day, I know many of you are out there on the front lines of this epidemic, providing services and leadership and necessary support to uplift our global community. Thank all of you for being on the front lines. Thank you, everyone, for doing what you're doing. I believe the critical role of public health has never been as understood as it is right now. I also believe that our school is best suited to take the lead in transforming this moment into a movement. Our dean, Michelle Williams, has set ambitious goals for our school, organized around 5 priority areas or frontiers: reimagining aging, overcoming violence, confronting climate change, cultivating well-being and nutrition, and conquering epidemics. Today's conversation and the HII initiative, which Professor Hofman just spoke about, are 2 examples on how the frontiers, specifically reimagining aging and conquering epidemics, are shaping our school's scholarship, educational programming, and outreach. I encourage all of you to learn more about our frontiers and visit the Chan School website. I'm joined today by 3 distinguished members of our community. First, Dr. Jaap Goudsmit, who is a Dutch scientist and coming to us all the way from Holland today. He is an adjunct professor of epidemiology at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and he is well known for his research in the fields of HIV and influenza. Our next panelist is Dr. Michael Mrna, an assistant professor in immunology and infectious disease at Harvard Chan School, and associate medical director in clinical microbiology in the Department of Pathology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. We also have with us Dr. Julia Wu, who is a research scientist in the Department of Epidemiology. She is a HII investigator as well, and is heading a research program examining on how immunity changes with age and how to predict immune responses among aging adults. As we know, the US government has, through its Operation Warp Speed, ordered millions of doses or pre-ordered millions of doses of vaccine and plans to distribute them as soon as they become available. Many of these vaccine candidates globally have reached stage 3 clinical trials, and one or more of them could be available by the end of the year or early next year. As we move toward a time when COVID-19 vaccine becomes available, we must address critical questions about the best practices to keep our global community safe. It's an honor to have this conversation with these 3 Chan School leaders. Thank you, Julia, Michael, and Jaap, for being here and sharing your expertise. I'd like to begin first with Michael, and Jaap, you can feel free to jump in as well. But Michael, if you could please give us a brief overview of where we are with the current leading vaccines, what separates them biologically, and where they are in the trial approval process.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. So I think just to give a very brief overview, because not everyone focuses their lives on vaccines and immunity. The way that vaccines work is they're designed to elicit immune protection. They want to, by injecting somebody or giving somebody an exposure to a pathogen or a piece of a pathogen, it can elicit an immunological memory and ultimately allow people to remember it so that when they do come in contact with that pathogen in the future, they can fight it off. And so the best thing that you can potentially do with a vaccine is create the type of immune response that would be needed to just stop the virus from even being able to bind and enter into the host and do any replication inside of the host. And so because of that, this virus works by binding a very specialized protein in the body called ACE2. And it's a famous protein. I won't go into details, but it uses something called the spike protein. So the virus has a spike and it binds to ACE2. So a lot of the vaccines, in an effort to prevent that binding, are essentially trying to get our immune systems to remember the spike protein, so that the moment they see a spike protein, we can form antibodies that will essentially block the spike from binding to any cells. So that's all to say that a lot of the vaccines that have been developed are now focusing on this spike protein, and the way that they do it is they provide and sort of support the sort of display of the spike to people in different ways. One of those is through what we call an mRNA vaccine, which is essentially we take the genetic code for the spike protein, and we can put it into people. And it kind of hijacks people's own machinery to then turn that genetic code into what looks like a virus spike protein, and that ultimately gives the body some exposure to it. There's also a different way. You don't have to just inject sort of mRNA directly into people. You can put it on a vector. And what that means is you can actually take the DNA of the spike protein, put it into a virus called an adenovirus in this case, and that can actually be used. So that's actually just a vehicle to get the genetic material into the person, and then their bodies again make a spike protein, but the actual coronavirus doesn't actually exist inside of the body. So those are two of the most promising avenues. You have an mRNA or a genetic code, or you put that genetic code onto an adenovirus. And so for example, I'll just give a few to say where these different vaccines are. There's a Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which was actually developed in part with right here at Harvard with Dan Baruch and HSPH and BI-DMC. And this is an adenovirus vectored vaccine. The DNA from the spike protein is put onto an adenovirus, and then that adenovirus is given to people. It doesn't replicate those, so it can't make people sick. And so this is an important vaccine, because Johnson & Johnson has already successfully developed an Ebola vaccine and has Zika vaccines in trials and candidate Zika vaccines. So this is a technology that's already been proven to a certain extent. And so using that same technology, Johnson & Johnson has pushed for a coronavirus vaccine along with Harvard. And one of the other neat features of this is it's the only vaccine currently that's really being pushed to only require a single dose, which is exceedingly important when it comes to the ability to produce these and distribute them and get them into people easily. So that vaccine is now in phase 3 trials. The aim is to vaccinate around 60,000 people and look at safety. So far, it's look at efficacy. So far, it's appeared to be safe. It's appeared to develop very good immune responses. And so now we just wait for the phase 3 trials to really get underway to see how well it works. Briefly, the other vaccine, the leading vaccine candidates, there's another one right here from Cambridge, Massachusetts called Moderno. This is an mRNA vaccine. This is one of the vaccines that has been pushed from the beginning by the federal government, really put a lot of dollars into it. And it is a promising technology, but it is an experimental technology. No licensed vaccine has come from Moderna at this point, but it's now also in phase 3, and all of these that I'll mention have been generally produced good immune responses and showed decent safety profiles. The other major one, which people may have heard about, is the Oxford and Astrazeneca collaboration. This is a vaccine that's also an adenovirus vectored vaccine. It is currently in phase 3, but in the US anyway, it remains on hold after there was an individual who, or maybe two individuals potentially, who have gotten what is neurological effects called transverse myelitis. And this is a worrying sign for a vaccine. Vaccines are known that they can potentially cause these rare neurological inflammatory diseases. And so there's a current investigation ongoing of the AstraZeneca vaccine to see, is it linked? Numerous other countries have decided it's not and have continued on with their trial, but the US is being a bit more cautious. And then the other major one is the Pfizer vaccine. This is with a German company called BioNTech, and it's an mRNA vaccine similar to Moderna's. And that is also in trials and has also showed similar immune responses. 2 Chinese vaccines are taking a whole different approach, and they're essentially taking the whole virus and killing it instead of just producing the protein. Those are now in phase 3 trials as well, and they're moving forward, and they hold promise because they're presenting the whole virus, not just a single protein to the person. But we'll have to really wait to see how they work. And finally, people may have heard about the Sputnik 5 vaccine from Russia, which is apparently ongoing and being distributed to people, but I would say largely we don't have much information about what exactly are the metrics behind that vaccine and its safety and immunogenicity. But I guess we'll wait to see. So that's sort of a brief overview of where we are with these vaccines.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate that. We'll move on to the first question on the panel, and that's going to be addressed to Jaap. Jaap, would you like to care to expand on any of the comments Michael gave us? Plus, the first question is regarding the actual vaccine and who should get the vaccine first. Should we administer the vaccine to first responders, healthcare workers, elderly, or those people in nursing homes? In your opinion, how should we address this issue?
First of all, thank you all for inviting me. I have to say 2 things. I'm the scientific director and CSO of HII, the Human Immunomics Initiative. And as a kind of disclaimer, I worked for 17 years in the vaccine industry, lately being employed by Johnson & Johnson when it acquired Crucell, which is are the developers of the adeno vaccine together with Harvard and Dan Baruch in particular. What I wanted to say about what you just initiated and what Michael said is I want to focus a little bit on who should get the vaccine and how this develops. And there are, of course, two ways of thinking of that. One is, of course, giving it to adults, which are most of the time also included in largest numbers in the trials. And as a vaccine, you need a label. In other words, there is a match between what you test in the safety trials as well as in the trials for efficacy in terms of age distribution and sex distribution of the trial population. And generally, you get a label of use for a market authorization for that groups that were included in the trials, which means that the majority of the people are, of course, of adult age, say 18 to 65 in general. And you add to that, particularly in the COVID vaccine situation, teenagers to a certain extent, but also in small numbers. And particularly also you add elderly people. Now, why is that a kind of consolidated fast track procedure? You have two issues here, which I want to address. The vaccine, of course, you can give to healthcare workers first, which I totally agree with. And however, those are mostly an adult population, so they're less prone to side effects. What will be the most important issue is particularly elderly and people with underlying diseases like we use for pneumococcal vaccine purposes and target, as well as for the influenza vaccination. So the key question now is, in the particular vulnerable populations, that includes also populations in the rest of the world who are either undernourished or are elderly in those positions, and that's particularly a concern of Gavi. As you know, that's the distribution system for vaccines in underdeveloped areas and lower income countries. So you have here a very interesting distribution situation where the elderly are the most vulnerable in multiple terms, and that is for HII one of the focuses. So we are particularly interested in how do we deal with and distribute the vaccine, and is it safe enough for an elderly population? So the future looks a little bit like this. When a vaccine is arriving, either being it very soon, like early next year, and with arriving, I mean accessible and available at a price that is affordable for those who actually it's targeted for. Is it accessible in terms of everybody who needs it, and at most, is it available? Now that's of course depending on two issues. Is it allowed to give those individuals, and is it actually produced in the numbers that actually are needed and the doses? And Michael made already the point that a single use and a single shot vaccine is of course in those situations preferable. So you can include it into elderly vaccination protocols, which includes flu, for instance. And of course, in terms of production, you need a lot less dosages. I would just eagerly put everybody emphasis a little bit on, you have to watch if actually what is the efficacy of the vaccine, which is, I expect, somewhere between 50 and 70%, but that's a guess, and that's the lower limit in general. And is it indicated not only for blocking transmission, but is it also indicated for blocking disease? Because the elderly population and the people with actually age-related diseases like cancer and cardiovascular disease are of course the most at risk for developing disease, COVID-19, in a very severe form. In other words, end up on ICs and actually have excess morbidity and mortality. So I think the main question here is, are we able to judge if the vaccines are actually reaching individuals who need it the most on top of the healthcare workers? And then I would mostly focus, particularly first on the elderly, if I may rank it a little bit on scientific merit, first on the elderly, secondly, and close to it, particularly in the most elderly, which generally are excluded from most vaccine studies in initial stages, and is it safe in those populations to actually give it, and if the immune response is actually, do you get a higher percentage of low or non-responders, in particularly the most vulnerable populations. So in conclusion, I would always say focus on the elderly and people of multiple condition, underlying health conditions, and subsequently expand after the healthcare workers to that. To give you a Dutch example, we have 17 million individuals who, and then I want to make one other point. What is very remarkable is that particularly children under 10 years of age get relatively small numbers of infections and actually have also a lower frequency of disease. It really starts from 10 to 12 up to later ages, and then with age, it accumulates in the risk of disease. So I would always say use that as a vaccine starting point, because the real goal is to protect people from the harm these viruses actually do. So that gives a little bit a complementary view to the vaccine progress. The last question you asked me a little bit is, what do you think? I think one of the most important things to watch is actually the safety profiles. So if you want to rank efficacious vaccines, one of the most important things for this vaccine, because there is so little experience with it, is it built on a platform that has proven to be safe, which in the case of J&J is the case, but also, for instance, the company Novavax, which makes a protein vaccine, which is, of course, in insect cells, which is an addition to the vaccines that Michael already mentioned, which I believe that it has also a very good safety profile in itself, because the safety is defined by the platform you use, plus the insert you use, and actually the insert itself, how it is presented. So a protein vaccine is, of course, generally, in our experience, of high safety profiles and high efficacy, not necessarily high level of duration. And the adeno vaccines, who are, of course, new on the market, but however are safe platforms, then the key question is, what does the protein do in those populations of that disease? Because we know that you run the risk of actually an antibody enhancement or anything that you have to avoid in those situations, which are known that coronavirus protein can actually do. So in the end of the day, I would say, for me, the most important thing is that safety is prime goal, plus the efficacy, because if an unsafe vaccine is given to highly vulnerable populations as the elderly, you might run the risk that you also impair the children's vaccination in situations where hesitancy and low confidence in vaccines is prominent.
Thank you, Jaap. I really appreciate those comments. It was well said. Before we move on to question 2 to Julia, Jaap, if you could just briefly, in 10 seconds, tell us about the logistical challenge of transporting these vaccines that require such cold storage, especially to remote locations.
Yeah, that I think is a very good point, because it is a vaccine, of course, is not only to license the vaccine for market authorization based on the criteria of efficacy of safety. It's indeed a enormous logistic enterprise, which takes the most of the time. People don't realize that. The process itself generally can take 5 years mostly. I mean, don't forget that the mumps vaccine, which was the fastest ever made, which was done in 1967, that was a vaccine developed in 4 years after, in 1963, Maurice Hilleman of Merck actually found that virus, and then it took 4 years. and to get it into people took another few years. So in other words, your logistic question is an enormous good one. The more you need to cold chain, which is essentially the question, how stable is the vaccine at room temperature and at different levels of refrigeration, defines how you actually get it distributed. There, a single shot is an advantage by definition, and an advantage is that it has a kind of half-life as a vaccine that actually can stand a certain amount of heating. So I would say it will be a huge challenge to get it, particularly in areas like Africa, southern East Asia, to get the vaccine, which is of prominent interest of particularly distributors of that sort, like the Gavi is doing. So I would say that will be the main time of lag time before it is at people, will be the logistic challenge of getting these huge numbers of vaccines worldwide distributed equally and inequity, and not getting the difference again between people who can afford vaccination and people who don't.
Thank you, Jaap. Let's move on to question 2, which I'm going to address to Julia. Julia, in 2019, the WHO listed vaccine hesitancy as one of its top 10 priorities. It's estimated 1.5 million deaths every year could be prevented by proper vaccine practices. In your research, you've noted that the greatest contributor to vaccine hesitancy is public distrust of health authorities. How is the scientific community addressing and approaching this challenge, Julia? I'd like to hear your expertise.
Thank you, Sri, and thank you everyone for being here together. So I would like to start by sharing that there is an overall trend in terms of integration of our the social scientists expertise along with the biomedical and the people like me who is an infectious disease epidemiologist. We came to a more concerted effort trying to understand the deeper roots of things like vaccine confidence in this particular pandemic. So as an example, then being the infectious disease epidemiologist, start with a collaboration with my historian colleague, Emily Harrison, and then we investigated further through historian analysis to draw the conclusion that really historical events matter in any of those vaccine confidence discussion. And the risk perceptions always will be embedded in historical, social, cultural contexts. And then the vaccine confidence will reflect a set of relationships with individuals as part of a community decision. There is a distinction between misinformation versus mistrust. So, and then there's other groups, such as the one at Johns Hopkins. There is a consortium that consists of social scientists, communication expert, as well as the virologists, immunologists, epidemiologists. So they came up with a recommendation report that consists concrete suggestions for the public health authorities to take on. So, and then the second particular approach that the scientific community is doing is trying to partner and being an advisory role to the public health authority. So recently, National Academies of Science, Engineer, and Medicine have recently released a draft framework for equitable allocation of a COVID-19 vaccine, and then is in the process of seeking public comment, which is very important to address the vaccine hesitancy and to build public trust in that arena. So they lay out a foundational principles for such an equitable framework, and then emphasize the equitable framework not only needs to be equitable, but also needs to be perceived as an equitable framework, especially by people who are social, economical, cultural, and educationally diverse, and who have distinct historical experience with health systems. So with a public face doing justice on both scientific and ethical foundations. So I think this is one step further from the scientific community point of view. And thirdly, National Vaccine Advisory Committee, which is our expert-based group to the HHS. They recently are putting together recommendations for the charge tasks assigned by Assistant Secretary. And then in that recommendations, I think they're trying to ask for major investment in public information and the community engagement, research, and advocacy for these new vaccines. And also, I think they propose to have an independent review of the vaccine safety and efficacy data by the scientific community. And speaking of that, there's a fourth kind of effort that scientists were doing. Major groups of scientists coming from all fields were signing letters to the FDA and to ask for transparent information to ensure a politically neutral process regarding the approval. And then there are vaccine confidence surveys that researchers are conducting, trying to listen and understand the fears and the concerns and provide more recommendations based on the community's feeling. And then six, based on the prior work of health disparity, researchers and scientists involved in community engagement, they're trying to do more research, integrating communication and other social science methods, and to together to conquer all those hurdles that are presented in the humanitarian crisis, working to get prepared for the COVID-19 vaccination campaign, given that those hardest hit communities are also the communities with the lowest vaccine uptake for the general vaccinations. So, and then for individual scientists, colleagues have been communicating with the public using social media and other traditional mass media to engage the general public and to combat misinformation. So these are all the very, very important approaches that the scientific communities are taking.
Thank you so much, Julia. Best of luck with your work and HII. It sounds really exciting, and we support you all the way. And that's actually a great segue into the next question, which I'm going to ask Michael. And Michael, one of the most significant challenges we face is the relentless propagation of misinformation, false information, and this is sparking a lot of unnecessary confusion and fear. So my question to you is, what practices need to be put in place to reduce misinformation, and who should be responsible for these efforts?
Well, it's a really terrific question, and I think society is ultimately responsible for these efforts. We have free press, and the media is really the major way that scientific information gets to the public. Unfortunately, we've seen a really interesting phenomenon happen with this particular pandemic. It is such a global crisis that has affected pretty much everyone in some way or another, that even the scientists and physicians who are working on the problems in this domain and for example, who are engaging with the media, sort of everyone has jumped into the space. And that's not necessarily wrong or bad, but we have seen a lot of confusion surrounding the biology of this virus, for example, and other features that I think have resulted from this massive amount of press that's being given in order to get the articles and get things written by the press and the media. People have essentially turned to, in many ways, anyone with an MD or a PhD after their name has been interviewed about things that are normally very, very niche. So infectious disease dynamics and infectious disease epidemiology is a pretty niche field of epidemiology. Vaccine immunology and infectious disease and respiratory virus kinetics and immunology is a fairly niche field of immunology. And then things like testing is a pretty niche field of pathology. And so, but despite how niche each of these fields is, we essentially have everyone weighing in on these issues. And I think it's created a lot of confusion. And that's because people who are being purported to be experts maybe don't have all the information, sort of because they haven't spent a career working on these viruses, for example. And so I think that one thing that needs to be done, the media should really start, I think we need to kind of rein things in a bit. The media should have some sort of checks on who they're talking to, what their background is, and really be able to know, is this person actually, does this person have expertise in this particular field that I'm interviewing them for example? That alone could make a really a big difference. But overall, I think what we need is, what we've also seen is when it comes to the way that information about the biology of this virus and the transmission of the virus has been disseminated, we have not seen powerful leadership, I would say, at the national level in terms of having a pretty good and solid message. We've actually seen a lot of things that have been completely confusing to the public and to the media, and frankly to scientists. Things are put on the CDC webpage and then removed, and there's a lot of questions around FDA regulatory practices and such. And so those types of waffling or those types of disagreements within the government are essentially starting to erode the trust of the public. And this is leading to a lot of confusion, I would say, by the average individual in America and across the world. And I think that particular problem really does rest on the federal government to figure out how to sort of start to coordinate their responses around science a little bit better. I would say that a place like Harvard and Harvard School of Public Health and academic institutions overall have generally done a very, very good job at trying to disseminate powerful and useful information that people are interested in, and good information based on the best science. But there is just so much information that's being disseminated right now that I think the average person has had a really hard time keeping up with it and trying to understand what it all means and what are the reputable sources, what are not. And we're truly, it's almost, I've heard it called an infodemic, and I think that's really what it is. And it almost is like we need a new field of epidemiology and science just to figure out how to convey appropriate information about epidemiology and science to the public. And we're in a new era. This is the first pandemic to happen in the face of sort of really, really widespread social media and Twitter and things along those lines. 2009 H1N1 was a little bit like that, but not nearly to the extent that we have social media today. And it does put us in a difficult position to figure out how to disseminate information appropriately. And I do foresee in the future, we might have, we might end up with sort of new regulations that do try to figure out how to use social media most appropriately to ensure truthful information and useful information is disseminated. For people who are, I'll give one example of where things were sort of erroneously, there was a lot of fear and anxiety that's been put out through the media, not intentionally, and this is why I give this example, and that's with this idea that immunity is waning after people get infections. This has been in the headlines, and it's made a lot of people question, is herd immunity possible? And it's made people say things like, this virus is totally distinct from any virus ever before because people's antibodies wane. Well, this is a really good example of a piece of data that is fully expected from people who normally study virus immunology and the immunology of what happens to somebody after they get a first exposure to a pathogen. It's very common to see antibodies burst up and then fall back down very quickly. That's basic immunology and biology. But a lot of people who don't normally study the immunology of viral infections and in particular primary viral infections the first time somebody gets it, maybe didn't necessarily fully appreciate that this is a common phenomena. And so what happened was the media took this and ran with it, and it has led to a lot of fear and anxiety that this virus is never going to be out of our systems and we're always going to be social distancing and contending with it. And that's just not true. But this was almost a it was a mistake that sort of based not out of misappropriation of data or something, but really just out of this infodemic of so many people weighing in that it had that we had maybe sometimes the wrong people weighing in who didn't necessarily have the basic understanding. And so I think we do have a big challenge ahead of us of how to figure out how to convey the most informative and useful information to the public. And I certainly don't have the answers. I think it's going to require governments and private industry to work very closely together.
Thank you, Michael. In the interest of time here, I think we're going to proceed next to some of the audience questions. And those of you who want to pose a question to our panelists, please use the chat function. And if we have time, we'll definitely get to that. Some people have already submitted questions in advance, and I want to get to one of those. Someone who's already asked a question addressed to Jaap. And Jaap, if you can take this question. Question is, why is there such optimism in actually coming up with a vaccine from a science point of view? Do you have confidence that we'll be able to come up with a safe, effective vaccine by 2021?
I already alluded before to the fact that the world record in vaccine development stands already for 50 years. In other words, it needs a concerted effort on 3 levels. I mean, it has a very interesting semantic connotation if you follow what Julia already alluded to, as well as Michael. It has to do with the fact that what do we consider if we say that we have a vaccine or that the vaccine is there? We all have to realize that the vaccine development process and a authorization and uptake are all different issues. In other words, when a vaccine is considered safe and is considered efficacious, and a regulatory agency, being in Europe or the United States or in Asia, approves it, that doesn't mean anybody is going to get it. That depends enormously on insurance situations and situations of access. So my optimism is that I think that the regulatory process might be able to approve one of the, say, 10 top contenders for efficacy and safety, depending on the regulatory environment and the criteria you use. The criteria could be relatively low efficacy but high safety, and that depends on the size of the trial and the distributions in the trials of phase 1, which is safety, phase 2, which is a kind of combination of safety at efficacious dose, and phase 3 is efficacious dose. But it will depend largely on also this access. So I would say if we talk about the regulatory environment, which is only step 1, then I think spring 2021 is a realistic one, or maybe end of 2021. There will be more than one maybe. But it could also be not true, but the chances are there. The key issue will be the distributability of that vaccine. In other words, is it stable? We discussed that before. Can we reach the people in need? And that depends on how we actually view it. Should it be a vaccine that actually ameliorates the disease, in other words, brings down the disease rate and therefore the mortality and morbidity to the disease? Is it a vaccine which blocks transmissibility, which is harder? And indeed, if we want mass vaccination, you need so many more dosages, which depends on how many dosages and boosting you need, how immunogenic it is, and subsequently on how you reach the population. And that brings in this hesitancy element, that how many people take up this vaccine. I just want to remember another historical element, which is the HPV vaccine against cervical carcinoma, which was indicated for children of 13 and up, and particularly women. And that vaccine actually had the lowest uptake of them all, when experts were saying that it was absolutely important that people take it. And it only took off, particularly in Europe and in those areas where there is a lot of hesitancy, when other element, not experts, were used to promote the vaccines or industry, but particular the social media of the people who actually are getting or wanting or needing the vaccine and their parents. So it depends a lot if there is a massive acceptance plus an availability at the level of people in need, particularly. I think there will be enough, and that's the final answer I would give, is I would say there will be enough for the healthcare workers, but will there be enough for vulnerable populations, for populations which live in rural areas, very difficult to get, in minority populations? Is the insurance system good enough to actually guarantee the uptake for everybody in need? And do you reach, for instance, low-income countries and countries in need? If you see now what happens in India, it will be very hard to control it. There is excellent vaccine industry in India. I just mentioned Serum Institute of India, which works with AstraZeneca together, and Serum Institute of India delivers 1 in every 3 childhood vaccines. So I think there will be not a shortage of vaccines, but will the uptake be equitably will the vaccine equitably distributed will be one of the major questions of the future after this pandemic.
Thank you, Jaap. In our remaining few minutes before we move on to Bert giving us some final thoughts, 2 quick sort of lightning round questions. If you can limit it to like 30 seconds or less. The first question is to you, Jaap, and that's, suppose there is no vaccine in the foreseeable future. Tell us about herd immunity. How many years would it take for us to get herd immunity? And when do you think we'd get herd immunity? 2022, 2023? Give us some target estimates, 30 seconds or less, please.
The 30 seconds I would just give to Michael, because he wrote several editorials.
You're going to get another 30 seconds after this, so you get 30 seconds now.
But I think herd immunity will be very difficult to reach because of the percentage infected individuals today in all the rich groups. If you need over 60, 70% of immunity minimally to get even close to herd immunity, that is not where we are currently and where we will be in any year very much in the future. However, what I think personally is this virus will be there to stay. It will be seasonal, presumably. I don't know, but I think it is, because if you look at the common cold virus, coronaviruses, that is what this does. The immunity will be lasting for a few years. So in other words, if there will be herd immunity, then I think it will come from the youngsters who get infected at a lot of ages, and that the main thing we have to think about is how to protect particularly healthcare workers and the elderly.
Thank you, Jaap. Appreciate that. Michael, I was reading a report from Amnesty International, a sad report estimating that worldwide there have been probably over 7,000 healthcare workers who have died from COVID-19. One question that has come up is, what can be done better to ensure better protection for our healthcare workers and access to these vaccines, especially internationally in some of the remote areas?
Well, I think one of the basic things that needs to be supplied to healthcare workers is PPE. More than anything else at the moment, healthcare workers, in particular those dealing with COVID patients, but also those dealing with any patients, because COVID might be affecting them, they should be, all efforts should be made to get them decent masks and basic ability to have hygiene and things like that. And so, but in some parts of the world, that's very difficult. I think that for any place where that's not currently happening, it should be made a priority. We can't treat patients if we lose our healthcare workers. And additionally, I think if vaccines come about, when and if they do, they should be prioritized, in particular to healthcare workers, and to some degree anyway. And also, I think robust surveillance testing amongst hospitals and amongst healthcare workers. We're right now seeing, for example, a big outbreak in Brigham, right next door, and that's in some ways due to a lack of appropriate surveillance that was not necessarily happening initially. And this is, if this can happen at Brigham, it can happen anywhere. And the last thing we want is for outbreaks to get away from us inside of healthcare facilities.
Thank you, Michael, Julia, Jaap. I really appreciate your expertise on this panel. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Bert for any final thoughts and closing remarks. Bert?
Sri, thank you very, very much. And of course, also great thanks to Julia, Michael, and Jaap. What you showed, of course, an update on the major vaccine initiatives, and that's quite impressive. And then I think we can say that we hear a guarded optimism on vaccine production. We will have it. It's a guarded optimism. Perhaps there is more realism on who will be able to receive it and how it will be deployed and what the particular populations are that we will address. Vulnerable populations, but also minority groups and countries that are not directly in the first line, so to speak. So guarded optimism, but also realism, I hear. Then major vaccine confidence issues. Vaccine hesitancy seems, I can use the word rampant, it's very high. And so we have a major issue there. The role of the media, social media, but also other media has been addressed. Very, very importantly, I think this will turn out to be one of the major issues of the COVID-19 pandemic. Then, where do we go? And I take one of the comments, or two of the comments. Yes, perhaps, even likely, it will be a seasonal virus. So we will get it under control gradually. It will not be immediately. And we will have programs, vaccination likely programs on this, similar to perhaps influenza. And that is something that is in the long run. It is not that we can already expect, of course, in the summer of 2021. With that, I thank you really very much for this, what I thought is very informative and very, how may I say, optimistic and realistic type of assessment. I thank Sri Sastry most sincerely for your moderatorship. You did so well. I mean, when there are presidential debates, they should have you rather than others who get this. I thank Julia Wu, wonderful. I thank Michael Mina, wonderful. I thank Jaap Goudsmit. And I thank the team of the Human Immunomics Initiative and those involved, majorly involved, of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Thank you very much for your attention. And I wish you a very, very, very good remainder of the day and a very good survival, if I may use the term in no sense, of this pandemic. Bye-bye.